inspection at a U.S. port of entry. Things you must know. If you are traveling to the United States for the first time, you are likely to have questions about what happens when you arrive at the port of entry. A foreign national traveling to the United States will arrive initially at a U.S. port of entry, or POE. The POE can be an airport, a land border crossing, or a seaport. Passing through a port of entry generally means that you are seeking permission from an immigration inspector, an official from the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, to enter the U.S. for a specific reason, purpose, and duration, which are generally always predefined. All foreign nationals arriving at a U.S. port of entry are inspected by officials of the U.S. government. This border inspection process involves 4 different inspections: public health, immigration, customs, and agriculture. Some or all of these inspections may be conducted by the same officer. Inspection at a U.S. port of entry. What do the CBP officials do? CBP are the Customs and Border Protection. Upon your arrival at the U.S. port of entry, you must present your passport and other required documents. CBP officers will review these to determine whether to allow you to enter the U.S. Your first encounter with the CBP officers will be a primary inspection station where they ask foreign nationals questions to determine their identity and nationality. If they decide to admit you, the CBP officer will also determine how long you will be allowed to stay and in what status you will be admitted. At the U.S. port of entry, CBP officials review passports, visas, and other supporting documents of each and every foreign national arriving in the U.S. The CBP officers also compare fingerprints, records, and name check databases for recent derogatory information. Ask questions about the foreign national's general qualifications for the visa that they have. Review the Form I-94 Arrival and Departure Record, or for visa waiver travelers, the Form I-94W. What kind of questions do the CBP officers ask? CBP officers at the U.S. port of entry will ask you questions to determine the true intent of your trip to the U.S. Inspection officers are trained and have the expertise to back up their training to identify if a foreign national has a preconceived intent behind their trip to the U.S. i.e., they're looking to see if you are actually coming to go to school or for a job interview when you say you are coming to visit Disneyland. If an officer is not convinced with your initial statements, they may ask you additional supporting documents before allowing you to enter the U.S. CBP officials, their power and authority. What can they do? CBP officials conducting inspections at a U.S. port of entry have complete power and authority, and it is up to their discretion to conclude whether or not a foreign national is eligible to enter the U.S. It is only after a CBP officer stamps and dates the I-94 form, places an admission stamp in the foreign national's passport, and the foreign national passes through the inspection station that the foreign national has been admitted to the United States. Secondary inspection. What leads you to this secondary inspection? If the first CBP official that a foreign national meets feels that the inspection requires additional time for review to determine a foreign national's actual eligibility, the officer may refer that foreign national for a, quote, secondary inspection. This secondary inspection at a port of entry is much more comprehensive review and can take several hours to complete. Generally, a foreign national referred for secondary inspection is not considered to be admitted to the United States. What generally happens in a secondary inspection? In secondary inspections, CBP officials will ask foreign nationals more detailed questions about their travel plans for the U.S. Foreign nationals may even be asked to produce additional identification and other documentation in order to determine their actual identity and the purpose of their visit to the United States. The foreign national and their belongings may also be searched, and the foreign national may be required to give a full set of fingerprints. Any person, foreign national, or person with a claim to U.S. citizenship and presenting a U.S. passport may be sent to secondary inspection at a U.S. port of entry if the CBP officer has reservations about admitting him to the United States. A person may also be sent to secondary inspection if there is a possibility the person is smuggling contraband or violating any other customs or immigration regulations or federal law in general. Let's take a look at a couple of cases. airport. When she stepped up to the immigration station, the officer noticed that she was more nervous than usual. After asking a couple of questions, she said she was coming as a visitor. He wasn't quite sure, so he referred her to secondary for further questioning. At secondary, they opened her luggage and found a wedding dress. At that point, she admitted that she was coming to the U.S. to get married, not to visit. Brad was on the same plane and got to the immigration inspection station shortly after Brenda. The officer wondered why he was carrying a briefcase, since his stated reason for travel to the U.S. was to see the sights and visit Disney World. It seems strange that he flew in through Chicago when there are much better flights to the Orlando area. Brad was also referred to secondary, where it was discovered that he had a stack of resumes in his briefcase and that he had several job interviews lined up over the next week. Both Brenda and Brad can be denied entry because they gave false information or withheld material and evidence from an immigration inspection at the time of their seeking entry into the United States. Arriving at a port of entry, a detailed look. Let's start with the airport. When your initial arrival in the United States will be an airport, the airline will give all non-U.S. citizens a form to complete while en route to the United States, either Form I-94, which is white, arrival departure record, or the I-94W, which is green, non-immigrant visa waiver arrival departure form. The form will ask primary identification information about and the address where you will be staying in the United States. Upon arrival, you will be directed by airline personnel or U.S. immigration officers to the inspection area. You will queue up in one of several inspection lines and speak with an immigration inspector. If you are a U.S. citizen, special lines may be available for you. If you are not a U.S. citizen, you should use the lines marked for non-U.S. citizens. If you are a U.S. citizen, inspector will ask for your passport, verify your citizenship, and then welcome you back to the U.S. You will then proceed to the customs inspection area. If you are a foreign national, the CBP officer must determine the reason for your trip to the United States, what documents you have to present, and whether you have those documents, how long you should be allowed to initially stay in the United States if all your documentation is in order. The time taken to determine these elements is usually less than 1 minute. If you are to be admitted and allowed to proceed, the inspector will stamp your passport and issue you a completed I-94. A completed form will show what immigration classification you were given and how long you are allowed to stay. This I-94 form, not your visa, indicates how long you may stay in the U.S. It is advisable that you do not lose the I-94 card, as you will need it when you leave the country. Completion of entry paperwork if arriving by air. Flight attendants will distribute the customs declaration forms, this is the CF-6059, and arrival departure record forms, the I-94, prior to your arrival in the U.S. These should be completed prior to landing and must be completed before you meet with an immigration inspector. Arriving at a land border. At a land border port of entry, you will undergo the same general process. However, one CBP officer may conduct all 4 inspections. That officer may send you to a secondary inspection area for further review or issuance of necessary papers. Once the initial CBP officer, the immigration inspector, determines to admit you to the United States, you may then be sent to customs or immediately allowed to proceed on your trip. Completion of entry paperwork if arriving by land. The CBP officer or at the port of entry will provide the necessary customs declaration forms, again the CF-6059, and the arrival departure record forms, the I-94, to be filled out upon your arrival. C. The U.S. immigration inspection process at a seaport of entry is similar to the airport process. However, oftentimes all inspections will be completed prior to the boat's arrival into the United States seaport. Completion of entry paperwork if arriving by sea. The CBP officer at the port of entry will provide the necessary customs declaration forms, the 6059, and the arrival departure record forms, the I-94, to be filled out upon your arrival. Documentation requirements while arriving at a U.S. port of entry. Each non-immigrant foreign national arriving at a U.S. port of entry must present a valid, unexpired passport issued by his or her country of nationality, and if required, a valid, unexpired visa issued by a U.S. embassy or consulate abroad. Foreign nationals entering the United States must satisfy any other applicable admission requirements. For example, United States Visitor and Immigration Status Indicator Technology Program, the U.S. Visit Program. There are special provisions for Canadians. Canadian citizens traveling to the U.S. do not require a non-immigrant visa, except while traveling to the U.S. for certain purposes, including treaty traders and treaty investors, those in E1 and E2 status, fiancé and children of a fiancé, K1 and K2, a U.S. citizen's foreign citizen spouse who is traveling to the U.S. to complete the process of immigration, the K3, children of that foreign K3, K4s, spouses of lawful permanent residents, V1, traveling to the U.S. to reside in the U.S. while they wait for final completion of their immigration process, and children of spouses of a lawful permanent resident, the V2. Permanent residents of Canada must have a non-immigrant visa, unless that permanent resident is a national of a country that participates in the visa waiver program, meets the visa waiver program requirements, and is seeking to enter the United States for 90 days or less under that program. Most Canadian citizens are also not subject to the U.S. Visit Program. However, citizens of Canada applying for admission with a non-immigrant visa, such as Canadian citizens with K or E visas, Canadian permanent residents, and Canadians with dual nationality who present a non-Canadian passport when seeking to enter the U.S. will be subject to the U.S. Visit Program and will have their fingerprints scanned and digital photograph taken by the U.S. immigration authorities. CBP officers may also refer a visitor for U.S. visit processing as part of the U.S. immigration inspection process, if there is concern about the nature of travel. The Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative, WHTI, requires Canadian travelers to present a passport or certain border crossing cards when seeking to get entry into the United States. Let's look at some special requirements for Mexicans. Citizens and permanent residents of Mexico generally must have a non-immigrant visa or a border crossing card, the so-called laser visa. Non-immigrant visas are not required for Mexican B1 and B2 visitors who are in possession of a valid unexpired laser visa border crossing card, the DSP 150, which can be issued to Mexican citizens seeking to enter the U.S. as a B1 or B2 visitor for periods of stay not exceeding 6 months. All other Mexican citizens must present a visa. Mexican citizens traveling to the U.S. using a border crossing card and traveling within the border zone will not generally be subject to the U.S. visit procedures. Mexican citizens planning to travel outside the border zone and or stay for more than 30 days must complete Form I-94 and will be processed through U.S. visit. Mexican citizens who participate in Century and or the FAST programs will not be enrolled in U.S. visit procedures until they are required to re-register as part of the U.S. processing to renew a multiple entry Form I-94. Mexican citizens are not impacted by WHTI document requirements. Mexican citizen visitors, including all children, are required to present a passport with a non-immigrant visa or a laser visa border crossing card to cross the U.S. border. This requirement applies to Century program members as well. The TN2 Mexican professionals who must also carry copies of documentation presented to the consulate when the visa was issued and presented if requested by the immigration inspector. Concluding now, the U.S. has numerous ports of entries that facilitate the entry and exit of persons and vehicles through its land borders with Mexico and Canada. The San Ysidro, California port of entry is the world's largest land border crossing for personnel and passenger vehicles. This port of entry alone processes over 2 million visitors per month, either as pedestrians or in passenger vehicles. The U.S. also has some of the busiest airports in the world, processing millions of passengers seeking to enter the U.S. each month. While this may seem a daunting task, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency has stepped up to the challenge. The U.S. in every phase of the inspection process takes the care and precautions necessary to make sure that they do not admit any persons who are not eligible for entry into the United States. If you have questions about the inspection at a U.S. port of entry or require assistance in coming to the U.S., contact VisaPro. Our experienced attorneys will be happy to assist you.